"It is a truth universally acknowledged," said Lord Peter Wimsey, shifting the volume of Burke's Peerage to the floor and lighting a Turkish cigarette with the nonchalance of one who had never quite grown out of college, "that a widow, expecting lilies, should not receive petunias, particularly if she is found dead beside them." The train from London had deposited Wimsey in the Northamptonshire village of Brackenton-on-Mire at a criminally respectable hour, 10:42 a.m. He had been enticed not by a murder yet, but by the prospect of a singularly unpromising clergyman's sermon on Renaissance sin, and the opportunity to inspect a rare Chalcedonian manuscript held at the vicarage under the guardianship of one Canon Drury, an acquaintance so dry, one suspected he only drank ink. He was ambling up the mossy gravel drive of the Gables, an over-windowed Edwardian house with the architectural sensitivity of a wedding cake, when he was met by the local constable, Sergeant Meeks, a man of such square solidity one could have used him to level paving stones. "Begging your pardon, my lord," said Meeks, cap rising and falling in anxious hands. "But we've had there's been a death." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. Brackenton-on-Mire doesn't strike one as the sort of place to go in for dramatic exits. "Whose curtain has fallen?" "Mrs. Telford, widow of Major Telford, house just here." Wimsey, whose interest in country widows was typically botanical or architectural, looked toward the conservatory adjoining the house. Glass doors stood open. To the garden, and in the weak June sunlight, one could see a chaise longue. Upon it, arranged in tragic repose, lay a woman of late middle age, respectably dressed, respectably dead. Her hand, oddly, rested on a small upturned basket of petunias. "No signs of violence," Meeks added quickly. "Doctor says heart failure most likely, but there's a look about it. Something's not quite tidy, and Mr. Merrow, her solicitor, insisted." "You ought to be consulted." "Merrow?" Wimsey smiled. "Of course. Grey as Milton's Satan and twice as inclined to litigation. We rowed together in '09. Could not row in time to save his soul." He bent over the body, squinting thoughtfully. "Tell me, Sergeant, has anyone remarked on the flowers?" "The petunias?" Meeks blinked. "Not as I've heard." "Because—" Wimsey straightened, dusting an invisible speck from his sleeve. "Mrs. Telford's gardener, an old fellow with a temper like a barbed fence, was quite firm, just yesterday, that she was expecting lilies for the anniversary of her husband's passing. It was a ritual, he said. Had been for years." "Yes, sir, but it weren't lilies that arrived." "No," said Wimsey softly. "It was petunias, a most vulgar substitution." He paused, inhaled, and then added with faint amusement, "You may not know this, Sergeant, but in the Victorian language of flowers, petunias suggest resentment or anger. A florally articulate murderer, perhaps." Sergeant Meeks shifted awkwardly. "You don't really think—" Wimsey, already strolling toward the conservatory's cluttered potting shelf, did not reply. His gaze lingered on a tipped watering can, a broken pot, and a faint trail of soil, leading not toward the house but into the garden beyond. There, a heavy sundial stood slightly askew beneath a trailing rose arch. He knelt, touched its edge. Dry, but a scratch along the metal rim suggested someone had moved it, perhaps recently. "Sergeant," he called, "do send for that gardener of hers. Tuppence, is it? And the maid. Oh, and Merrow too. The widow may have died of natural causes, but one does wonder. Why was she expecting lilies and received petunias? And why, when she died, was she holding them?" He turned, smiling faintly. One always suspects something nasty when flowers arrive on the wrong day. Wimsey waited precisely 36 seconds. He counted them silently while examining the ironwork of the sundial, before Sergeant Meeks reappeared, somewhat flushed and escorted by a thin, sunburnt man in worn corduroys, whose expression carried the same mild disdain as one of Kipling's older sergeants regarding the incompetence of officers. "Tuppence, sir," announced Meeks unnecessarily, as if presenting a particularly disappointing cabbage. The gardener gave a curt nod. Joseph Tuppence. Been with the Telfords 17 years. If this is about the flowers, I told Mrs. Telford 3 days ago the lilies was no good this year. Aphid blighted and stem rotted. I said so. Told her I'd substitute something cheerful. Cheerful, murmured Whimsy. A fascinating motive in horticulture. And did she approve of your substitution? She didn't say, said Tuppence, his eyes narrowing slightly. Seemed distracted. I left the petunias by the conservatory steps. Quite. So, and did you see her take them up? No. Went round to the back garden. She was in her chair reading something or other. That's the last I saw her. And what time was this exactly? 10:15, near enough. Old bell at St. Mark's rang out right after. Ah, the reassuring tyranny of bells, said Whimsy, tapping the sundial again. And who else was in the house this morning? The maid, young Elsie. Bit of a flutterhead, always listening to wireless songs in the kitchen. Sergeant Meeks sniffed. She says she was polishing the silver, and that she never went near the conservatory. That, said Whimsy, is perhaps the most suspicious thing she could possibly have said. Would you mind asking her to join us? The maid appeared within minutes, summoned from the pantry by Meeks's bootsteps. She was pink-cheeked, breathless, and visibly nervous, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron with mechanical regularity. She curtsied to Whimsy, then looked pleadingly at the sergeant. I didn't do nothing wrong, sir. Honest. I was in the back corridor, doing the brass doorknobs like I was told. Mrs. Telford, she said to leave her be till after 11. Whimsy smiled in the fashion of a cat, observing a mouse politely deny knowledge of cheese. Of course, Miss Elsie. And did you happen to see anyone come or go through the front garden? Any visitors? She shook her head. No, sir. But I did. Hear the side gate bang shut round 10:30. Didn't think nothing of it, wind's tricky that way. Indeed. And what of Mr. Merrow? Was he expected this morning? She looked startled. Oh, yes, sir. 11 sharp every Tuesday. Goes over the accounts with Mrs. Telford. Used to be with the Major, too. Whimsy nodded slowly. A regular habit. Curious, then, that he should have arrived today to find her. Unexpectedly. Indisposed, Elsie paled. I didn't know she'd gone. Not till Mr. Merrow called me in. Whimsy dismissed her gently, watching her retreat into the house like a rabbit who suspects the hutch door has been left open on purpose. Sergeant, he said thoughtfully, there's a detail here that scratches at the brain like a poorly tuned violin. The widow, we are told, was alone in the conservatory from approximately 10:15. The gardener left the flowers. The maid insists she didn't approach until Merrow arrived at 11. He pointed to the petunias. But someone moved the flowers from the step to her lap, and if she were already dead when they were placed there, why would one do such a thing? Not decorative, not sentimental. So either she placed them herself, or someone wished us to think she had. Sergeant Meeks looked uneasy. You think it was staged, sir? I think, said Whimsy, lighting a cigarette and flicking the match into the rosebush with surgical precision, that the dead rarely concern themselves with floral arrangements. Now, let us see what Merrow has to say. And do check the side gate. If it banged shut, someone either came or went. Perhaps both. Mr. Arthur Merrow arrived precisely 10 minutes later, punctual and pressed. He wore a charcoal morning coat, a tie with a pattern so conservative it had probably been voted into office, and a frown that suggested the day had already gone wholly off script. His head was lean, almost hawk-like, and his eyes were not accustomed to looking up. Peter, he said with brusque civility, dashed nuisance this, but I thought, well, you know how things can be. Something about the whole matter smelled off. Quite right, said Whimsy. And when things smell off in Northamptonshire, one rings for me, very proper. I take it you found her thus? Merrow inclined his head. Yes, arrived at 11. found the conservatory doors open and Mrs. Telford reposed. I called out. She didn't answer. Then I noticed the stillness, you know. Even before I touched her wrist, I knew. Always the lawyer, said Whimsy. Precise, observant. Do tell me, when was the last time you spoke with her? Yesterday, briefly. She'd asked me to bring a copy of the revised deed for the cottage she intended to leave to her niece, Miss Rowena Miles. Ah, yes, murmured Whimsy. The niece, artistic, I gather, lives in London. A blotchy style in oils and an equally blotchy fiancé. Merrow hesitated. They're not entirely settled. Mrs. Telford was concerned. Concerned enough to change her will. Merrow did not blink. That would be privileged information. But you did bring a revised deed? Yes, she had not signed it yet. I brought it again today for final approval, Whimsy smiled. So it remains unsigned. Merrow stiffened. Indeed. How awkward for Miss Miles. Or depending on one's philosophical stance. How fortunate. Merrow's lips pressed. Together. Whimsy studied the man a moment longer. One final query, Arthur. The conservatory. You found it open. Are you quite sure the outer doors were unlatched when you arrived? Wide open, said Merrow promptly. Flung wide. The wind had begun to rise. There were petals on the floor. Ah, said Whimsy, his voice going faintly distant. Petals. Nature's breadcrumbs. He turned abruptly and strolled through the conservatory, retracing the supposed events of the morning. The position of the chaise, the trail of dirt, the empty watering can, the disarranged sundial, and, most tellingly, the overturned brass thermometer on the garden table, its mercury column broken and leaking. Whimsy reached out, touched the brass casing, and nodded once. Sergeant, he said, I believe we are nearly ready to test. A small theory, but first we require a minor item of theatricality. He bent beside the sundial and adjusted it slightly, aligning its base with the scratch in the paving stone. There. When something is moved in haste, it often leaves behind a signature. Sergeant Meeks squinted. But what's it mean? It means, said Whimsy, his voice quiet, that our dearly departed widow had not merely been reading in her chair this morning. She was watching something, or someone. And then she got up, retrieved the flowers, and died not long after. He turned. We need to speak to Miss Miles. But she's in London, Meeks protested. Whimsy smiled thinly. That's what we've been told. Let's see if the telegraph agrees. He tapped the petunia basket once, gently. Time and flowers. They tell the story better than people do. The telegram arrived with remarkable promptness, considering the sleepy pace of Brackenton-on-Myre's post office. Whimsy held the thin sheet of paper between thumb and forefinger, squinting at the terse message, Rowena Miles, in London. Not expected back for weeks. Disputes with solicitor over will, requests immediate conversation. Ah, murmured Whimsy, folding the telegram with the deliberate care of a man handling a delicate conspiracy. Miss Miles, it seems, is in the capital and decidedly unsettled. Naturally, we shall have to pay her a visit. But before London, I believe there are matters here that require our attention. Sergeant Meeks nodded, though his appetite for metropolitan adventures remained questionable. Right you are, my lord. Shall we start with the widow's solicitor? Precisely. Merrow's testimony was instructive, but incomplete, as solicitors tend to be, especially when wills and money mingle. One suspects a certain guardedness. They returned to the Gables, where Merrow was waiting in the drawing-room, having taken to pacing with the kind of brisk impatience reserved for men who live by schedules of cold certainty. Whimsy greeted him with a nod and settled into an armchair, fingers steepled. Arthur, you mentioned Miss Miles and the revised deed. Pray, how long have you served the Telfords? Since 1910, Merrow replied. Before that I was with a London firm. Mrs. Telford was my most esteemed client. And the Major? Your client too? Yes. Major Telford was a man of strict habits and a strict will. He left a substantial estate, and the widow has managed it with admirable care. That is why I find this morning's incident so perplexing. Whimsy gave a tight smile. Indeed. And what of the widow's relationships with her neighbours, the village, any recent disturbances? Merrow's eyes narrowed faintly. Mrs. Telford was known to be reclusive but well-mannered. Her niece was the only frequent visitor, and even then only sporadically. Ah, a social butterfly, said Whimsy dryly. Only she did not fly often. Merrow shrugged. Miss Miles is an artist. London is her proper haunt. She prefers it there. Unsurprising, but if she's embroiled in a dispute over the will, that suggests something more than mere artistic temperament. Merrow's face darkened. The dispute is over the cottage, part of the Major's legacy, which Mrs. Telford intended to bequeath to her niece. There was talk of altering the deed to clarify ownership. Miss Miles wanted to ensure she would inherit it outright. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. And this revised deed was brought here yesterday? Yes. Mrs. Telford was considering it, carefully. And did she sign it? No, she had reservations. I advised her to wait. Whimsy's gaze flicked to the window where the garden lay bathed in a soft, melancholic light. Curious hesitation. One wonders what might cause a woman to delay finalizing such a document. Merrow shifted uncomfortably. Personal reasons, I imagine. Ah, yes. The most elusive of causes. Emotional undercurrents are always harder to navigate than legal ones. With that, Whimsy rose and excused himself, leaving Merrow to his pacing and muttered frustrations. Outside, the garden seemed innocent enough in its afternoon tranquility. Yet, as Whimsy wandered slowly toward the conservatory, he noticed the faintest trace of disturbed earth near the base of the sundial. He knelt, brushing the soil gently. Something glinted, a small scrap of fabric, navy blue, with a delicate silver thread woven through. "Sergeant," Whimsy called. "This may be a clue, though trivial in size. The texture suggests a garment of quality, possibly a gentleman's cravat or an accessory to a morning coat." Meeks examined it with less confidence but nodded. "Shall I have it bagged and sent to forensics?" "Do, and discreetly. It might ruffle feathers if the whole village knew we were hunting threads and petals." Their return indoors was interrupted by a sudden knock on the front door. Whimsy opened it to find a trim, angular woman dressed in a sharp navy suit. Her eyes, an intense blue-grey, regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and guarded relief. "Lord R." "Peter Whimsy?" she asked, voice clipped but steady. "The same," he replied with a bow. "You must be Miss Miles. I regret that our meeting is under such grave circumstances." "Mrs. Telford was my aunt," Rowena said, stepping inside. "I've come to understand what happened." Whimsy gestured toward the drawing room. "Please, to sit. Your telegram reached us swiftly, though I fear the news has unsettled you." Rowena sank into a chair, smoothing her skirt. "I was on my way back yesterday, but delays kept me in London. I'm afraid I did not reach her in time." "Miss Miles, I understand you had some disagreement with Mr. Merrow regarding the revised deed?" "Yes. I wanted to ensure the cottage would pass directly to me. My aunt was hesitant to sign the documents." "Did she express why?" Rowena hesitated. "She spoke of memories. The cottage held more than bricks and mortar. It was tied to the Major's past. She feared some stipulations in the will might be contested." Whimsy nodded. "Such legal entanglements often obscure deeper motivations. May I ask, was anyone else aware of this hesitation?" Rowena shook her head. "No. It was a private matter. Even the servants were kept at arm's length." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Sergeant Meeks. "It seems secrecy is a common thread here." The conversation shifted as Rowena recounted recent visits to the Gables. My aunt was restless these past weeks. She spent hours in the garden talking to herself, or so it seemed. Were there any visitors besides yourself and Mr. Merrow? Only Joseph Tuppence, the gardener. He was loyal, but gruff. I sensed tension between them. Any indication as to its cause? No, but I heard raised voices once, through the conservatory window. Wimsey tapped his chin thoughtfully. Raised voices? At what time? Just before 10 on the morning of her death. A moment before the flowers were delivered. Rowena nodded, biting her lip. It upset her greatly. Something about the lilies. She was adamant that no substitutes be accepted. Precisely. Our earlier observation, Wimsey said softly. Petunias, not lilies. A substitution that might well have symbolic weight. Rowena's eyes flickered. Do you think someone wanted to send a message? Wimsey smiled faintly. In the language, a flower's messages are often more potent than words. Anger, resentment, or something more complex. The door opened abruptly, and Meeks ushered in Joseph Tuppence, who looked as though he'd just escaped a scolding. Mr. Tuppence, we require a full account of your actions on the morning in question, Wimsey said calmly. Tuppence shifted his weight, voice rough. I did what I could. Told her the lilies were ruined. She took it badly. Said the garden had been her last link to the Major. I left the petunias by the door and went round back to prune the roses. And did you notice anyone else about the property at that time? No, sir. Except the maid, Elsie. She was busy with her polishing. Did Mrs. Telford seem unwell? Agitated? Both, said Tuppence grimly. She was pale, shaking. Said she felt faint but wouldn't sit down. I left her to rest, but when I came back the chair was empty. Wimsey looked sharply at Meeks. And where was the basket of petunias? Tuppence frowned. Still by the door, I thought, yet we found it in her lap. Someone moved them. Rowena's voice was low. Could she have moved them herself? Before she collapsed? Possible, said Wimsey. But then we must ask, what was she watching? What caused her to rise, carry the flowers, and then suffer the fatal event? Stood and paced slowly. Miss Miles, you mentioned raised voices. If that is true, then we have two possibilities. Either the argument was with someone present in the house that morning, or the voices came from outside. Rowena looked troubled. The garden is bordered by thick hedges and a high wall. Hard for voices to carry far. Yet the side gate was heard to slam. Someone came or went. Wimsey's eyes rested on the faint scratch by the sundial. And someone left a scrap of fabric behind. That fabric is the colour of morning coats, not gardening smocks. He turned to Meeks. We must trace who wore navy blue with silver thread this morning. Meeks nodded briskly. I'll start with the village and any visitors who passed through. Wimsey lit a cigarette and smiled wryly. Excellent. Meanwhile, Miss Miles, I suggest you remain at the Gables. There is much to be learned from the silence of a house and the stories its shadows whisper. Rowena hesitated, but nodded. I'll do whatever I can to help. As she settled by the window, staring out at the garden now cloaked in late afternoon haze, Wimsey's mind churned through the layers of detail. Petunias instead of lilies, raised voices unheard, a secret hesitation over a will, a garden gate slammed, and a scrap of fine fabric on the disturbed earth. None of it yet formed a complete picture, but the threads were drawn taut. And Lord Peter, Wimsey, master of unravelling the tangled skeins of human nature, knew the next move would be crucial. The morning air at Brackenton was brisk and tinged with the dampness of early June, when even the brightest day seemed hesitant to fully bloom. Lord Peter Wimsey's footsteps echoed softly on the uneven cobbles as he made his way towards the village's small library and museum, a modest affair presided over by the venerable Mr. Archibald Penhaligon. The man was a living archive of local law and genealogical minutiae, known for his prodigious memory and an eye for detail that rivaled any modern detective's notebook. If anyone could shed light on the tangled past of the Telford family, it was he. Penhaligon greeted Wimsey with the slightly austere courtesy befitting a man accustomed to solitary research and sporadic visitors. His thin lips curved into a faint smile when Lord Peter mentioned the purpose of his visit. "Ah, the Telfords," Penhaligon began, adjusting his pince-nez as he settled behind the oak desk. "A family of notable history and notable scandal. Your interest must be piqued by more than mere happenstance." "Indeed, Mr. Penhaligon. I'm investigating the recent and somewhat peculiar death of Rose Telford at the Gables. There are indications of concealed motives, perhaps linked to long-buried grievances." Penhaligon nodded sagely. "Quite so. The Telfords have a habit of collecting grievances as others collect stamps. The family's troubles stretch back nearly 2 centuries, with numerous internal disputes, contested inheritances, and whispers of disgrace." Wimsey leaned forward, his tone adopting the veneer of polite inquiry, though his mind was already parsing the implications. "Might you have records or anecdotes of particular relevance to Mrs. Telford, or her late husband, Major Telford?" "Certainly. The Major was a man of stern principles and rigid routines, but not without enemies. There was an infamous dispute some 15 years ago involving a cousin, Reginald Harrow." Wimsey's pulse quickened. "Harrow, you say? The same surname as our enigmatic visitor, Francis Harrow?" "Ah, you have already made the connection," Penhaligon murmured. "Reginald Harrow was a distant relative who quarrelled bitterly over the family estate. He vanished under mysterious circumstances shortly after the dispute, presumed dead, though no body was ever found." A thin smile flickered over Wimsey's face, shadowed by a growing sense of intrigue. "Curious indeed. And Mr. Francis Harrow's arrival here now seems less coincidental." "Precisely. The past often reaches from the grave with long fingers," Penhaligon remarked gravely. Wimsey's thoughts raced. The presence of Francis Harrow, the missing cousin's namesake, or perhaps a son, introduced a new dimension to the case. Was the late Major's past a trigger for present violence? Or was the connection a convenient distraction? Penhaligon handed over a carefully catalogued volume of family trees and correspondence. Wimsey skimmed the faded pages, noting mentions of disputes over wills, contested land rights, and references to a sealed letter held by Rose Telford that was never revealed publicly. "This sealed letter," Wimsey queried, "could it have contained revelations capable of upending the family's equilibrium?" "Most certainly," Penhaligon replied. "Rose was known to guard it jealously. It is said to contain confessions or claims that would invalidate the current will." With these new threads entwined firmly into his mental tapestry, Wimsey left the library, his mind alert to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere at the Gables. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from beneath layers of polite facades. Upon returning to the estate, Wimsey found the household abuzz with quiet activity. The servants had resumed their routines, but the shadow of death lingered palpably, an invisible presence casting long, cold echoes. Wimsey requested to speak once more with Joseph Tuppence, the gardener. The man was found tending the herbaceous borders with an air of suppressed agitation, his hands dirt-streaked, but his expression wary. "Mr. Tuppence," Wimsey began, his voice measured, "we have reason to believe that the quarrel you had with Mrs. Telford was but a symptom of deeper tensions within the household. Might you elaborate?" Tuppence shifted uneasily, wiping his brow. "It's true we disagreed about the rose bushes, yes, but that was petty. Miss Rose had been under strain of late, and her moods could turn like the weather. There was talk, whispers among the staff, things about Mr. Harrow, things I dare not speak openly." Wimsey pressed gently. "Whispers are the currency of the cautious. You may trust that discretion is assured." The gardener's eyes darted nervously. They said Mr. Harrow was no mere visitor, but someone with designs on the estate, perhaps to unsettle the family or worse. And the Major? Was there ill will towards him as well? Aye, sir. The Major was a proud man, set in his ways, and not everyone agreed with how he managed things. Some felt he kept secrets even from his own kin. The layers of concealment thickened, and Wimsey sensed the gardener's reluctance to speak more was rooted in fear rather than forgetfulness. Such reticence was rarely accidental. Turning his attention to the household staff, Wimsey called for Elsie, the maid who had reported hearing unusual noises the night of the murder. Her demeanour was hesitant but earnest. "Miss Elsie, you mentioned voices from the garden on the night in question. Did you recognize the speakers?" She nodded. "Yes, my lord. It was Mr. Harrow and Miss Miles. They argued in low tones near the conservatory. I didn't catch all, but Mr. Harrow sounded angry, and Miss Miles tried to calm him. Did they part amicably?" "No, sir." Miss Miles seemed upset, and Mr. Harrow stormed off toward the village. "Thank you, Miss Elsie. Your testimony is most helpful." Wimsey made a note of the strained dynamics between these two figures, now added to the complex interplay of relationships at the Gables. Later, in quiet reflection, Wimsey reviewed the timeline once more. The telegram sent at just before 10 by Harrow, his later presence near the estate, the gardener's quarrel, and the secretive movements of the household suggested a carefully choreographed deception. What puzzled Wimsey most was the deliberate staging of the flowers on the body, an act both cruel and cryptic. What message was the murderer attempting to convey? Or was it merely a red herring designed to mislead? He recalled Dr. Clement's assertion that the bruising was consistent with a blow rather than a fall, and the missing salver from the drawing room, an object of some worth, its absence unaccounted for. At this juncture, Wimsey resolved to inspect the various timepieces throughout the house once again. The discrepancies in the clocks, while minor, might hold a key to understanding the chronology of events. If someone had manipulated the time, then alibis based on it would be unreliable. In the grand hall, Wimsey crouched beside the grandfather, clock, inspecting its pendulum and gears. The clock had been deliberately stopped at 9:47 p.m., minutes before the supposed time of the murder, though Mrs. Telford was found at dawn. His fingers brushed a faint smudge on the clock's face, suggesting it had been handled in haste. Nearby, the mantel clock was 4 minutes fast, and the pocket watch found on the gardener's bench was 20 minutes slow. These discrepancies, Wimsey mused aloud, suggest a deliberate attempt to confuse and mislead. Our murderer understands time as well as he understands the weaknesses of his victims. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the estate, a knock interrupted his thoughts. Rowena Miles entered, her expression more composed than earlier, but no less grave. "My lord," she said quietly, "there is something you ought to see." In the library, among Aunt Rose's papers, I found a letter addressed to her from a solicitor, dated just days before her death. Wimsey accepted the envelope with interest, recognizing the official seal. Breaking the wax, he unfolded the letter with care. The contents revealed a summons to a meeting regarding the estate's future, hinting at a pending revision to the will that would have altered the distribution of assets significantly. The letter was unsigned but bore the unmistakable watermark of a London law firm. "Another thread," Wimsey remarked, "pulling us deeper into the web of ambition and betrayal." Rowena's voice trembled slightly. "Do you think Aunt Rose was afraid of this change?" "It is likely," Wimsey replied. "Fear, after all, can be as lethal as any weapon." The afternoon waned into evening, but the threads of the mystery tightened inexorably. Lord Peter Wimsey, with his customary blend of wry amusement and steely determination, prepared to delve ever deeper, knowing full well that the next revelation might unsettle the very foundations of the gables and the quiet village that surrounded it. Thus, beneath the polite veneer of country life, the gears of deceit ground inexorably on, and the widow who expected flowers had more than one mourner watching and waiting for the truth to bloom. The evening at the Gables was settling into that peculiar liminal state where shadows lengthen, but the darkness is not yet complete, when Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once more in the drawing-room. The heavy curtains were drawn back to admit the last pale light of the day, but the atmosphere was already thick with expectation. The household had grown quieter, as if the walls themselves awaited the next revelation. Wimsey stood near the fireplace, the letter from the solicitor held loosely in his hand, the inked words still vivid in his mind. A revision to the will, unsigned and yet potent, suggested urgent dealings in the days before Rose's death, a motive that was as financial as it was psychological. Rowena Miles, having taken her leave after delivering the news, had retreated to her chambers, leaving Wimsey with a silence that was more companionable than oppressive. He allowed his gaze to drift to the now infamous salver, conspicuously absent from its usual place. The absence nagged at him. Why remove an object so innocuous? And why, of all things, a salver? His musings were interrupted by the soft click of the door, and in stepped Inspector Parker, who had been more observer than participant in recent conversations. Still chasing shadows, Lord Peter? Parker remarked with a wry smile. More like chasing the puppeteer behind the curtain, Inspector, Wimsey replied. Have you made any progress regarding Mr. Francis Harrow? Parker sighed. Harrow's story is as slippery as an eel. He insists he arrived in the village only last week, but there are discrepancies in the accounts of his presence. Several witnesses claim to have seen him before that, though none can say with certainty. Ah, the mutability of memory, Wimsey observed dryly. Yet memory can be forced to reveal its inconsistencies under careful scrutiny. Tell me, has Harrow provided any account of his relationship with the Major? Only vague hints. He claims to be a distant relative, here to settle old family matters. But his temper is thin, and he bristles when questioned about the Major's disappearance of some years ago. Curious, Wimsey murmured. The missing cousin, presumed dead but never confirmed. One wonders if this Francis Harrow is more than he appears. They were interrupted by the arrival of Joseph Tuppence, the gardener, who appeared hesitant yet resolved. Lord Peter, sir, there's something I should say, he began, glancing nervously between Wimsey and the inspector. Wimsey inclined his head. Speak freely, Mr. Tuppence. The gardener swallowed hard. I didn't mention before, but the night of Mrs. Telford's death, I saw someone near the west wing, near the old conservatory. It was late, and the figure was moving fast, clutching something long and thin. Couldn't see their face, but I'm certain it wasn't Mr. Harrow. Did you recognize the figure by gait, clothing, or any distinguishing feature? Wimsey asked, his interest piqued. No, sir, it was too dark. But the manner of their walk was different, lighter, quicker. It struck me as odd at the time. Wimsey's mind immediately began to reassemble the puzzle pieces. The presence of a second nocturnal visitor added a new layer to the chronology. This person, moving swiftly with a suspicious object, might well be the key to the entire mystery. Thank you, Mr. Tuppence. Your discretion has been invaluable. As the gardener left, Wimsey and Parker exchanged glances heavy with implication. The tight-knit threads of the evening were beginning to unravel. Determined to clarify the timeline, Wimsey returned to his room and laid out his notes, cross-referencing witness statements with the peculiarities of the clocks scattered throughout the Gables. The grandfather clock stopped time at 9:47 p.m. The mantel clock's slight acceleration and the gardener's slow pocket watch combined to a deliberate orchestration designed to befuddle and mislead. If the murder occurred around 10 p.m., as the bruising suggested, the stopped grandfather clock was a calculated piece of the puzzle. Whomever intervened had to be intimately familiar with the household's rhythms and devices. The question then arose, who else had access to these timepieces and knowledge of their peculiarities? The household staff, the visitors, or perhaps the victim herself? Whimsy's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Rowena Miles, looking pale and troubled. "My lord, I have something that might interest you," she said, extending a small parcel wrapped in faded brown paper. Unwrapping it carefully, Whimsy revealed a bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon, yellowed with age but preserved meticulously. "These belong to Aunt Rose," Rowena explained. "I found them hidden behind a loose panel in the library. They seem to be correspondence with someone named E. Fairchild." Whimsy's eyebrows rose. And who might Mr. or Miss Fairchild be? None of us knew, Rowena confessed. But the letters suggest a long-standing secret correspondence, one filled with worry, plans, and fears. Opening the top letter, Whimsy began to read. "My dearest Rose, the shadows grow longer, and the walls of Brackenton close in upon us. I implore you to trust no one but me, for your safety depends upon it. The secrets you guard are dangerous, and those who seek to claim what is not theirs will stop at nothing." A chill passed through Whimsy. The tone was urgent and deeply personal. Whoever E. Fairchild was, their relationship with Rose had been profound, perhaps intimate, and certainly fraught with peril. "Rowena," Whimsy said quietly, "this changes everything. It appears Rose Telford led a double life, at least in correspondence, shielding her fears and plans from everyone here." Rowena nodded, eyes wide with apprehension. "I fear she was more isolated than we realized. The discovery of the letters added weight to the suspicion that the murder was not merely the culmination of family quarrels or financial disputes, but rooted in hidden fears and unseen threats." Whimsy's mind returned to Francis Harrow. Was he aware of these letters? Did he see in Rose's death a means to an end? Or was he merely a convenient scapegoat in a deeper game? The following morning brought fresh revelations. Whimsy had arranged to speak with Elizabeth Fordham, the housekeeper, a woman known for her iron will and impeccable memory. Elizabeth greeted him with the formality of one accustomed to control, but Whimsy detected the subtle tension beneath her composed exterior. "Mrs. Fordham," Whimsy began, "you have served the Telford family for many years. I wonder if you might clarify a few details concerning the household on the night of the tragedy." She inclined her head, steeling herself. "I will answer as best I can, my lord." "Were there any unusual occurrences? Visitors, movements, or disturbances that might have escaped notice by others?" Elizabeth hesitated, then spoke in measured tones. "There was a knock at the kitchen door late that evening. Unusual at such an hour. I sent young Tom to see who it was, but he returned saying there was no one there. It seemed a phantom visitor, and I confess it unsettled me." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "Was this before or after Mr. Harrow's departure from the village?" "Shortly before," she replied. "I thought it odd that Mr. Harrow left abruptly, as if avoiding something, or someone." "And the staff? Were their movements accounted for?" "All but one," Elizabeth admitted quietly. "Tom disappeared for nearly an hour that night. When questioned, he claimed to have been in the stables, but no one saw him." Whimsy's thoughts snapped sharply into focus. The staff movements, the mysterious nocturnal visitor with a long object, the hidden correspondence, all suggested that the web of deceit was more tangled than anyone had admitted. He requested to see Tom at once, and the youth was summoned. Nervous and wide-eyed, Tom was soon before Whimsy, who regarded him with a mixture of sternness and sympathy. "Tom, you went to the stables the night your mistress was found dead. What took you there, and why did you keep it from Mrs. Fordham?" The boy swallowed and stammered. I I was scared, my lord. I thought I saw someone, but I didn't want to cause trouble. Who did you see, Tom? Speak plainly, and you'll find no fault here. After a moment's hesitation, Tom whispered, I saw Miss Miles talking with someone by the old conservatory. They were carrying something, a crowbar, I think. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. And what of Miss Miles? Did you tell her you saw her? No, sir. I was afraid she'd be angry. The puzzle pieces began to click into place. The crowbar, the secretive meeting, the mysterious letters, all pointed towards a carefully concealed conflict, escalating into tragedy. Wimsey's next steps were clear: to confront Rowena Miles and press gently on the nature of her relationship with Rose Telford, and to probe deeper into the mysterious Mr. Francis Harrow's true intentions. As the day waned, Wimsey felt the familiar thrill of the hunt stir within him. The surface civility of the Gables masked a roiling undercurrent of secrets, lies, and suppressed passions. The widow who expected flowers had instead harvested suspicion, and in the shadows of her death, the final act was yet to unfold. The evening had settled once again over the Gables, draping its ancient walls in a velvety gloom that softened the sharp edges of the day's revelations. Lord Peter Wimsey, seated at the heavy oak desk in the library, allowed his mind to trace the delicate threads of the tangled affair that had taken shape. The correspondence from the elusive E. Fairchild, the gardener's shadowy sighting, the mysterious departure of Francis Harrow, and now Tom's timid disclosure, all seemed to converge, yet the full picture remained just out of reach. It was in these moments of quiet contemplation that the subtler clues began to glimmer like distant stars against the night's obscurity. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of Rowena Miles, whose expression bore the unmistakable marks of unease mingled with resolve. She stepped inside with the grace of one accustomed to navigating the invisible currents of power and propriety. "My lord," she said, voice low but steady, "you wish to speak with me?" Wimsey gestured to the chair opposite. "Indeed. Miss Miles, I find myself intrigued by a curious detail. You were observed near the old conservatory on the night in question, in the company of an unidentified individual carrying what Tom believes was a crowbar. Would you care to elucidate the nature of this clandestine meeting?" Rowena's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping momentarily before she regained it with a measured sigh. "Very well. It is true I met with a man near the conservatory, but I assure you, it was not for any nefarious purpose." Wimsey inclined his head, signaling her to continue. "The man was Francis Harrow," she confessed, "and the object was not a crowbar, but a length of piping he wished to use to repair a broken section of the greenhouse." "An innocuous errand, then?" Wimsey's tone carried a gentle skepticism. "On the surface, yes," Rowena replied, "but the truth is more complicated. Francis and I have been acquaintances for some years. Our relationship has always been, shall we say, fraught with complications." Wimsey's interest deepened. "Complications of what nature?" "Old grievances, debts unpaid, and misunderstandings compounded over time. Francis sought to reconcile some matters, but I feared his presence might inflame tensions within the household. And yet you met him in secret." Wimsey's observation hung in the air. "I wished to prevent scandal," she admitted. "Rose had a delicate constitution, and the last thing she needed was discord stirred by an unwelcome visitor." The weight of her confession underscored the fragile web of relationships that surrounded Rose Telford's final days. Wimsey's mind flicked back to the letters, the tone of fear and secrecy, and the vague warnings of danger. "Miss Miles," he said, "do you know of these letters? The ones addressed to Rose from a certain E. Fairchild?" Rowena's face paled. "I had no knowledge of those letters until recently. Rose was fiercely private. Do you suspect anyone in this house might have wished to keep such correspondence hidden?" Rowena's hesitation was telling. "I cannot say for certain, my lord, but I do know that Rose had enemies, some closer than one might expect. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Parker, who bore a sheaf of documents with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to chasing facts. "Lord Peter, I've been through Harrow's papers," he reported. "There's a curious set of letters here, official correspondence, debts, and a series of notes from a law firm in London." Wimsey accepted the papers and skimmed through them. Harrow was evidently embroiled in some financial entanglement, an inheritance dispute no less. This aligns with the suggestion of a double life, or at least a hidden agenda. "Indeed," Parker agreed. "And there's more. Harrow's arrival here was under a false name, and his passport records are suspiciously incomplete." "An imposter, then," Wimsey mused. "This casts new light on the timeline. If he arrived earlier than claimed, it might explain the conflicting witness accounts." The inspector nodded. "We should also revisit the accounts of the staff. They may have been pressured into silence or misled." Wimsey stood and stretched, the weight of the investigation pressing down but invigorating his faculties. "I intend to conduct a thorough review of the household staff's whereabouts on the night of the murder," he declared, "including a careful re-examination of the security and soundproofing of the West Wing." Parker smiled. "I thought you might say that." As the night deepened, Wimsey moved to the conservatory, its glass panes reflecting the flickering candlelight and the encroaching darkness beyond. The place bore the faint scent of damp earth and decaying foliage, an incongruous setting for a murder mystery, yet one that seemed charged with hidden meanings. He ran his fingers along the frame of the door, noting the slight warping of the wood near the latch, a subtle imperfection that could allow a door to be left ajar unnoticed. This might account for Tom's sighting of the shadowy figure. Further examination revealed faint marks near the baseboard, scratches consistent with the dragging of a heavy object, possibly the crowbar or piping mentioned by Rowena. The soundproofing of the adjoining rooms came under his scrutiny next. The thick walls and heavy drapes, designed to muffle noise and preserve privacy, also created opportunities for deception. If a sound were deliberately suppressed, an intruder's movements could go unheard. Returning inside, Wimsey found the household gathered for dinner, a collection of uneasy faces and guarded glances. The servants, usually so rigid in their roles, appeared strained, as if the very walls of the gables weighed on their spirits. Seizing the moment, Wimsey addressed them with his customary blend of charm and incisiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for your cooperation thus far, yet it seems the truth remains hidden behind a veil of silence. I ask you to recall, were there any unusual noises, movements, or visitors you might have thought insignificant, but now see in a different light?" A murmur rippled through the group. The cook, Mrs. Havisham, broke the silence. "I heard footsteps in the corridor late that night," she said, voice trembling slightly. "But when I looked, the passage was empty." "And you, young Tom?" Wimsey prompted gently. Tom swallowed and spoke hesitantly. "I heard voices in the library, sir. A man and a woman arguing." "Do you recall what was said?" Wimsey inquired. "Only bits, sir. Something about the papers and the will." The mention of papers stirred something in Wimsey's mind. The solicitor's letter, the secret correspondence, the inheritance dispute, all seemed inexorably linked. "Thank you, Tom," Wimsey said softly. "You've been very brave." As the evening wore on, Wimsey felt the slow tightening of the investigative noose. The enigma of Rose Telford's death was less a simple act of passion or greed, and more an intricate dance of hidden fears, desperate alliances, and masked identities. In the quiet aftermath of dinner, as the household retired and the candles guttered low, Wimsey resolved to revisit the letters from E. Fairchild, to probe the timeline of Francis Harrow's movements with renewed precision and to unearth the secret from the West Wing that had been concealed beneath layers of polite pretense. The widow who expected flowers had sown a garden of shadows, and Lord Peter Wimsey intended to follow the faintest trail to its root, no matter how dark or grotesque the path might prove. The following morning, the house stirred into its usual rhythm, though beneath the surface, an almost imperceptible tension had settled like a dust-laden shroud. Lord Peter Wimsey, with the faint air of a man who finds solace in the company of puzzles rather than people, retreated to the privacy of his room to examine once more the letters of E. Fairchild. Each one, penned in a cramped but deliberate hand, revealed fragments of Rose Telford's increasingly troubled state, references to threats, veiled warnings, and an undercurrent of dread. Yet the cipher was not in the words themselves, but in their timing and context. The earliest letter was dated scarcely a fortnight before Rose's demise, while the last arrived on the very day of her death, or so the postmark suggested. Was this last letter truly delivered, or was it merely part of the conjuring of shadows? Wimsey's fingers paused over a peculiar phrase in one of the earlier letters. The roses you expect may not bloom as you imagine. An allusion, perhaps, to the symbolic language of flowers, long known in Victorian parlance to convey secret messages, a detail to be noted and filed, no matter how trivial it seemed. By mid-morning, Wimsey was ready to resume his inquiries. His first call was to the study of Mrs. Harriet Penrose, Rose's closest friend and confidant, whose aloof manner scarcely masked a simmering unease. "Mrs. Penrose," Wimsey began, "your presence in the days preceding Miss Telford's death was frequent. May I ask if there were any recent changes in her demeanour or acquaintances that troubled you?" Mrs. Penrose sipped her tea with an air of cultivated distaste. Rose was ever fragile, Lord Peter, but of late there was a shadow upon her spirit. Something she would neither disclose nor discuss. I urged her to confide in me, but she grew distant, secretive. Perhaps it was the presence of that Harrow man. "Indeed," Wimsey remarked. "A man of many guises, it appears. Do you know more of his history?" She hesitated. "Only that he claimed to be an old family acquaintance, though one whom I personally mistrusted. He had the look of a man with debts to settle. Perhaps debts beyond the financial." The implication hung heavy between them. Wimsey, noting her reticence, chose to shift the conversation gently. "May I inquire if Miss Telford ever mentioned any visitors who arrived unannounced? Perhaps someone whose presence was disapproved?" Mrs. Penrose's gaze flickered toward the window as if to seek escape. "There was a man, an unfamiliar gentleman, who called on Rose twice within a fortnight. She admitted nothing of him, but I saw the look in her eyes, fear, or perhaps guilt. Did you happen to see his face?" "No. He was always careful to keep to the shadows, and Rose ensured no one else met him." Wimsey's mind turned over the possibilities. The web of secrecy was wider than initially imagined, the layers of fear more profound. He thanked Mrs. Penrose and excused himself, his thoughts shifting to the servants and their still unexplored testimonies. Down in the kitchen, the hum of activity was punctuated by whispered conversations and furtive glances. Wimsey approached Mrs. Havisham, the housekeeper, whose face bore the marks of years spent balancing authority with discretion. "Mrs. Havisham, might I trouble you to recount for me the whereabouts of the staff on the night Miss Telford passed away? I am particularly interested in any inconsistencies or odd behaviour you may have noticed." Mrs. Havisham wiped her hands on her apron before answering. "Well, sir, it was a quiet evening at first, but there were moments that seemed, how to put it, unusual. For one, Mr. Collins, the butler, was notably absent from his usual rounds for a good half-hour just after supper." "Did he offer any explanation?" "None that I was privy to, my lord. When questioned, he claimed to have been inspecting the wine cellar. But I know that cellar well, and it's impossible to miss when someone enters or leaves. yet no one saw him go down or come up. This struck Wimsey's attention. The butler's unexplained absence at a crucial time was a detail he had not yet considered seriously. Could Collins have been involved, or at least witnessed something hidden from the others? And the other? Servants? Wimsey pressed. There was young Tom, as you know, who claims to have heard voices. Miss Maud, the maid, was unusually nervous. She dropped a tray that night, which was quite unlike her. The housekeeper sighed. It's all very distressing. We all loved Miss Telford, despite her quirks. And now we are all under suspicion. It seems, Wimsey offered a rare smile. Your loyalty is commendable, Mrs. Havisham. It is precisely such devotion that often hides the truth in plain sight. The remainder of the morning was spent methodically cross-checking the servants' schedules, matching their accounts against the layout of the house and the known timelines. It was then that a curious anomaly emerged. The clocks. Wimsey noted that the grandfather clock in the hall, the mantel clock in the library, and the small timepiece in the west wing all showed times discordant by several minutes. Far from a mere inconvenience, this temporal dissonance had allowed windows of opportunity for movements and actions to occur unnoticed. Wimsey called for Inspector Parker and laid out his discovery. Consider the implications. If the clocks are unsynchronized, then the staff's recollections of when events occurred are rendered unreliable. It creates a fog through which the truth may slip. Parker rubbed his chin thoughtfully. A neat trick, if deliberate. Precisely, Wimsey said. We must establish who had access to these clocks and whether the discrepancy was a recent development or an accident. They decided to examine the clock mechanisms directly. It was then that a small detail drew Wimsey's eye, a nearly imperceptible smear of grease on the winding key of the hall clock, fresh enough to suggest recent tampering. Who maintains these clocks? Wimsey asked. Tom, mostly, Parker replied. He takes pride in them. Wimsey frowned. A boy of 14 with access to every part of the house and an apparent knack for deception. We must question him again, with care. Later that T.T. Afternoon, in the small, dimly lit sitting room where Tom had first confessed to overhearing the argument, Wimsey sat with the boy. The boy's eyes darted nervously as Wimsey's gaze bore into him, calm but unyielding. Tom, Wimsey began, you told me of voices arguing about papers and the will. Have you thought since then about who might have been involved? The E. Boy hesitated. I don't know, sir. I heard one voice, the man's voice, and a woman's, but it was dark, and I couldn't see their faces. Wimsey leaned forward. Was the man's voice familiar? Did he speak in a way you recognized? Tom nodded slowly. It was Mr. Collins, the butler. I know his voice. Why do you think Mr. Collins was arguing with Miss Telford about papers? I don't know, the boy whispered. But later that night, I saw Mr. Collins going into the west wing near the locked door. Wimsey's mind raced. The west wing, the very place Rose had taken refuge according to the servants' whispers. The locked door, which no one had been permitted to open. Could this have been where the final act took place? He pressed the boy gently. Did you see Mr. Collins come out again? Tom shook his head. No, sir. I waited, but he didn't come out. Then in the morning, the door was open. Wimsey stood, his pace quickening. The pieces were falling into place with a deliberate, sinister precision. A locked door, a silent argument, a tampered clock, a butler with unexplained absences, each a cog in the machinery of deception. As he made his way to the west wing, Wimsey's thoughts lingered on the faint scent of roses, the spectral shadow of E. Fairchild, and the whispered promise that the roses you expect may not bloom as you imagine. The flower language, the letters, the inheritance, it was all tied together in a knot waiting to be untied. The door to the west wing stood before him, the lock surprisingly yielding to a gentle push, as if invited to reveal its secrets. Beyond was a room shrouded in dust and neglect, its windows shuttered, its atmosphere heavy with the residue of secrets long buried. And there on a small table lay a single withered rose, crimson and brittle, a final message from a widow who had expected flowers but received something far darker. Whimsy touched the rose with a thoughtful frown and stepped back into the corridor, the shadows lengthening as the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from its hidden recesses. Whimsy closed the door behind him with a measured click that echoed faintly in the silent corridor, his mind already piecing together the significance of the withered rose in the neglected west wing. That small, delicate remnant was not merely a botanical curiosity. It was a deliberate symbol, a cryptic flourish left behind by a woman whose life had been strangled by secrets and deceptions. It bespoke an intention, a message, one that needed decoding before the hour slipped beyond reach. He found the key to the lock still in his pocket, the cold metal a contrast to the warmth of the late afternoon sun filtering through the latticed windows elsewhere in the house. Yet here, in this forgotten room, the light was muted and waning, as though time itself had chosen to retreat. The dust motes danced slowly in the faint illumination, undisturbed save for the faintest trace of footsteps that had vanished into the ether. There was something else. A faint, lingering scent, just beneath the rose's perfume, a whisper of lavender and something sharper, metallic. Whimsy's trained senses twitched. A clue or a trick? He crouched to inspect the surface of the table on which the rose lay. Smudged marks in the dust betrayed a hurried removal of papers or objects, as if someone had been in a desperate search for something, or attempting to erase a trace. He straightened, recalling the boy Tom's story about the argument overheard, concerning papers and the will. The inheritance, the contested fortune, was no longer just a peripheral suspicion, it was the very axis upon which this entire mystery revolved. But why involve the butler, Mr. Collins, and what was his true role in this tangled affair? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps, careful, deliberate, approaching along the corridor. Turning sharply, Whimsy found Inspector Parker standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mounting concern. "Lord Peter," Parker said quietly, "I have just been speaking to Maud, the maid. She confirms that Mr. Collins was seen leaving this wing late last night, around the time the clocks were supposedly checked. She claims he looked agitated, almost pale." Whimsy nodded. "And did she notice where he went?" "Towards the wine cellar, oddly enough. That fits with Mrs. Havisham's earlier comments about his absence during the evening rounds." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. The wine cellar and this wing are connected by the servants' corridor, but the timing remains suspicious. "Have you thought of questioning Mr. Collins again?" "I have, but I prefer to have more evidence before I corner him." Whimsy's tone was measured, masking the sharp edge of anticipation beneath. "Meanwhile, Parker, I want you to verify the recent maintenance records for the clocks, and if possible, the logs of deliveries or visitors over the past week. Something tells me that the discrepancy in the clocks is no accident, but a deliberate act to distort time itself." Parker made a note. "Very good, my lord. I'll have that on your desk by this evening." With a nod, Whimsy bid the inspector farewell and moved down the corridor toward the dining room, where he had been told Lady Ainsley had taken refuge since the tragedy unfolded. The house was alive with whispered conjectures, furtive glances, and the low hum of unsettled nerves, but Whimsy moved through it like a ship cutting a path through fog, steady, unflappable, with purpose. Lady Ainsley, a striking woman whose grief seemed sharpened by indignation, greeted Whimsy with an icy veneer that barely concealed her turmoil. "Lord Peter," she said stiffly, "I trust you have made progress in uncovering this dreadful business." Progress, Lady Ainsley, is a peculiar creature, sometimes slow and incremental, sometimes swift and decisive. May I ask, Have you any further thoughts on the night of Miss Telford's passing? Anything that now strikes you as unusual? Lady Ainsley's eyes flickered toward the window, where the last light of day began to wane, only that Rose was more frightened than she admitted. The flowers, the letters, all seemed part of some game she played with herself to ward off an invisible enemy. A game with very real consequences. Whimsy paused. And this mysterious visitor, the man who called twice, do you know more of him? Lady Ainsley's lips pressed into a thin line. Only that he was neither invited nor welcome, and yet Rose was reluctant to confront him openly. There was fear, yes, but also shame. Perhaps an entanglement she wished to conceal. An entanglement that might involve the inheritance? Whimsy's tone suggested he found this more than plausible. I dare say yes. The family fortune, always a source of whispered tension, could drive even the most decorous to acts of desperation. Whimsy inclined his head thoughtfully. Desperation indeed. And such acts often leave the faintest trace, if one knows where to look. He left Lady Ainsley with a courteous bow, his mind turning once again to the servants' quarters. The question of motive tangled inexorably with the who and the how. Collins, it seemed, was a man under pressure, a man who had access, opportunity, and now a suspicious alibi. As dusk deepened, Whimsy made his way to the wine cellar, a cool, shadowed chamber whose shelves groaned under the weight of vintage. Bottles and dusty crates, the air smelled of earth and fermented secrets. Here, beneath the surface, the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Whimsy ran his hand along the stone wall, then paused by a particular rack where a bottle had been recently removed. The cork was loose, the label slightly smeared. A hasty cover-up, perhaps. He searched the immediate area and found a scrap of paper caught between the bottles. A note, hastily folded, its edges worn, but the ink still legible. Meet me at midnight in the West Wing. The truth cannot wait. A chill ran down Whimsy's spine. Who had written this? Who had left it? And why had it been hidden here? Suddenly, a shadow flickered at the entrance, and Whimsy turned to see Mr. Collins himself, face drawn and eyes wary. Lord Peter, Collins said, voice low, I did not expect to find you here. Whimsy held up the scrap of paper. Care to explain this, Mr. Collins. It seems you have been conducting secret meetings, or at least planned to. Collins swallowed hard. It is not what you think. I meant no harm to Miss Telford. There are matters you do not understand, old debts, obligations, things that bind me beyond this household. Yet you were seen arguing with her on that fateful night. Collins's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and desperation. I argued only because she threatened to expose me. If the clocks were tampered with, it was to buy time, to find a way out. But I swear, Lord Peter, I did not kill her. Whimsy studied him closely, noting the tremor in his hands and the beads of sweat on his brow. Very well, Mr. Collins. I shall hold you to your word, but the truth will emerge one way or another. As Collins retreated, Whimsy's gaze lingered on the entrance to the West Wing once more. Midnight approached, and with it a promise that the house's dark secrets would no longer remain buried. He resolved to be present when the next move was made, aware that the final act was fast approaching, and that every shadow, every whispered confession was but a step toward unveiling the murderer hidden among them. The hour before midnight was a study in shadows and silence, the great house seeming to hold its breath beneath the encroaching darkness. Lord Peter Whimsy, seated by the window of the dimly lit library, watched the flickering shadows that the moon cast through the mullioned glass. The manor was no longer merely a residence, it was a crucible, distilling human motives into their purest, most volatile form. The note found in the wine cellar, its ominous promise, had unsettled the servants and family alike. Yet Whimsy felt only a quiet satisfaction. The game was advancing, pieces moving inexorably toward the inevitable checkmate. He reviewed once again the chronology as it stood. The clocks, deliberately misaligned, had shifted perceptions of time. The argument overheard by the kitchen boy. The cryptic message left by an unseen hand. The contradictory accounts of Mr. Collins. Lady Ainsley's veiled allusions to fear and shame. Each thread, tangled in apparent confusion, had begun to unravel beneath the light of logic and observation. Footsteps approached softly, and Whimsy turned to find Inspector Parker entering with his habitual mix of anxiety and professional respect. "Still no sign of Collins or the note's author, my lord," Parker reported quietly. "The household is restless. Many are locking their doors and whispering about ghosts and curses. Ah, the supernatural, always the first refuge of the uninformed," Whimsy remarked dryly, rising to his feet. "Fear is a natural human foible, but we must keep our wits sharper than the superstitions that infest this place." Parker nodded, though the tension in his brow remained. "I've also cross-checked the clock repairs. Nothing official was logged. It appears someone tampered with them clandestinely, which points to premeditation." "Indeed." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "Premeditation demands motive and opportunity. We are closing in on both." They moved quietly through the halls toward the West Wing, where Whimsy had resolved to witness the midnight rendezvous promised by the note. The servants had long since withdrawn, and the manor was eerily deserted, except for the occasional creak of timber settling and the distant hoot of an owl. The corridor stretched before them, the walls lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the intruder's passage. The air was cooler here, and the faintest hint of lavender mingled with the mustiness of disuse. A door stood slightly ajar, its brass handle catching a sliver of moonlight. Whimsy gestured for Parker to stay close, then pushed it open with deliberate care. Inside was a modest sitting room, furnished in fading elegance. A small table bore the remnants of tea, 2 cups, one tipped over, stained with a shadow of lipstick. On the mantelpiece, a clock ticked unevenly, its face cracked, the hands frozen at 11:55. Whimsy scanned the room, noting details with the precision of a surgeon. The curtains were drawn but not tightly. The window latch was broken, as if recently forced. A chair was overturned near the hearth, and the faintest smear of mud marked the carpet. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, slender and pale, her eyes wide with alarm and guilt. It was Maud, the maid, the only servant who had dared confide in Whimsy. "Lord Peter, I couldn't stay silent any longer," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's more to this house than anyone knows." Rose was afraid, not just of debts or family disputes. There was someone she trusted, but who betrayed her. "Who, Maud?" Whimsy's tone was gentle but probing. She hesitated, then spoke the name in a barely audible breath. "Mr. Collins." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "You believe the butler is involved in more than mere skulking?" "Yes. I saw him last night after everyone had gone to bed. He wasn't where he said he'd be. And there was a letter. He was burning something in the kitchen stove. I couldn't see what, but it was important." "Why tell me this now?" Whimsy asked. "Because I fear for my own safety. I don't know who else to trust." The room seemed to contract under the weight of her confession. Whimsy nodded solemnly. "You have done the right thing, Maud. We must confront Mr. Collins, but with caution." As the clock in the hall chimed midnight, Whimsy motioned for Parker to remain on guard and stepped out to face the darkened corridor, alone. The house's stillness was suddenly shattered by a faint sound, the scraping of footsteps retreating down the servants' passage. Swiftly, Whimsy followed, his movements silent and sure. Near the wine cellar, He glimpsed a shadow slipping through the doorway. "Mr. Collins," Whimsy called softly, "I believe we have unfinished business." The butler halted, then turned, face drawn and eyes hard. "Lord Peter, you persist where discretion would serve better." "I seek only the truth. You destroyed a letter last night. What was its content?" Collins's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. "Letters speak louder than actions, my lord, and sometimes actions must remain hidden. Yet your actions now betray you. Why conceal the letter unless it held a secret too perilous for the light?" A tense silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the faulty clock above. Then, with a sigh, Collins reached into his waistcoat and produced a folded sheet of paper, carefully preserved despite the fire. Whimsy unfolded it. The letter was addressed to Rose Telford, written in a firm, unmistakable hand, one belonging not to Collins but to a solicitor in London. It detailed a codicil to Rose's late father's will, granting her exclusive control over a previously hidden trust fund, conditional upon her marriage to a man named Hawthorne. Whimsy looked up sharply. "Mr. Collins, who is this Hawthorne? There is no mention of him in the family records." Collins's eyes darkened. "He was Rose's fiancé, a man of charm and recklessness, whose debts threatened to engulf us all. She kept the engagement secret, fearing the family's disapproval." "And you?" Whimsy pressed. "What was your role in this clandestine arrangement?" "I sought to protect the estate, my lord. Hawthorne's interference was ruinous. I confronted Rose, hoping to persuade her to break the engagement, but she refused. Until the night of her death," Whimsy murmured. Collins nodded. "Yes, she planned to meet Hawthorne and discuss their future. I intercepted a letter from him, threatening exposure of certain indiscretions if she did not comply with his demands." Whimsy's mind raced. The tangled web of love, greed, and fear was tighter than ever, yet the puzzle was still incomplete. Where? "Is this Hawthorne now?" Collins's face hardened. "Gone. Fled to the continent after Rose's death." "But he is not the murderer." Whimsy's lips curled in a faint, ironic smile. "That, Mr. Collins, is precisely what we shall determine." As Collins was led away by Parker, Whimsy returned to the sitting room. His gaze lingered on the overturned chair, the broken window latch, the scattered mud. Someone had forced entry or exit here, and the motive was buried in the shadow of that final confrontation. He would wait, watch, and let the house reveal its secrets. The final act was near, and in the cold logic of deduction, all would be laid bare, no matter how bitter the truth or grotesque the means. The night had deepened into a stillness so complete that even the manor's ancient timbers seemed to hold their breath, as if awaiting the final stroke of a masterful hand. Lord Peter Whimsy, standing quietly in the great hall, surveyed the assembled family and servants with the faintest expression of amusement playing about his lips, a look both knowing and mildly exasperated, as if the conclusion of this peculiar drama were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to his evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "I trust you will forgive my prolonged absence, but certain matters demanded the full exertion of my faculties. Faculties, I might add, sharpened not by mere chance but by an unwavering devotion to precision and logic, qualities regrettably scarce in the current household." A murmur rippled through the group, some faces pale, others defiant, all eyes fixed upon him with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "I am here to unravel the mystery of the late Miss Rose Telford's untimely demise," Whimsy continued, "and to demonstrate that beneath the veneer of superstition, gossip, and misdirection lies a truth as stark and unyielding as the ancient stones of this house." He paced slowly, allowing the silence to grow, each footfall deliberate. "First, the chronology, the misaligned clocks, the staggered testimonies, the contradictory alibis. It was a subtle manipulation of time itself, an attempt to create confusion where clarity should reign. His eyes rested briefly on the gathered witnesses. Then the letter, destroyed yet partially preserved, revealing the secret engagement. To one, Mr. Hawthorne, a man whose financial recklessness threatened the estate, and whose disappearance conveniently removed him from suspicion. But absence, dear friends, is not innocence. He glanced toward the butler, Mr. Collins, who stood rigid, his face a mask of impassivity. Mr. Collins, your role was that of guardian and gatekeeper, yet also of manipulator. You sought to protect the family fortune, but in doing so, you betrayed its trust. The butler's eyes flickered ever so slightly. Miss Telford's death, Wimsey went on, was no mere accident, or the result of some spectral curse, but a calculated act. The broken window latch, the overturned chair, the smear of mud, signs of a struggle, yes, but more importantly, evidence of a carefully staged scene intended to mislead. He raised a gloved hand. The crucial piece, however, was the motive, rooted not in greed alone, but in a complex weave of fear, jealousy, and desperate control. Mr. Collins feared the ruin Hawthorne's return would bring, feared scandal more than the law, and took it upon himself to silence Rose rather than allow her to dismantle the fragile peace he sought to maintain. A hush fell. Collins's facade cracked, an almost imperceptible twitch of the lips, a shadow crossing his eyes. Wimsey's gaze sharpened. You confronted Rose in her sitting room that fateful night. When she refused to renounce her engagement, the situation escalated beyond reason. In a moment of panic and misguided loyalty, you struck her down. Collins's shoulders sagged. The mask of the impeccable butler was shattered. I did what was necessary, he murmured, voice low but unsteady. Necessary? Wimsey repeated softly, the hint of irony unmistakable. You will find, sir, that the law is less forgiving than even your sternest self-judgment. Turning to the assembled, Wimsey concluded, this house, like all great estates, harbours many secrets. Yet it is only through the clear light of reason and observation that justice may prevail. As the constables moved to detain Collins, Wimsey stepped aside, lighting a cigar with the calm assurance of a man who had restored order to chaos. To the living, the past is but a series of inconvenient truths, he murmured to Parker, and, to the dead, a silent testament that even the most carefully concealed secrets will, in time, bloom like the flowers Rose so loved, only to wither beneath the harsh scrutiny of justice. With that, he strolled toward the door, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, leaving behind a household forever altered and a mystery resolved with the exacting grace befitting Lord Peter Wimsey.